Chapter 5, Tower Town and Magic City.
Tower Town's boundaries were the wealthy Gold Coast to the east, Little Sicily to the west, Division Street on the north, and Grand Avenue to the south. State Street was the main north-south road bisected by Chicago Avenue from east to west. As I have mentioned, an art colony took root in Tower Town following the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition. Several studios opened to attract artists after the exposition closed. By the start of World War I, the area was rife with Greenwich Village-style bohemians, new businesses springing up to meet their needs and desires, bookstores, tea rooms, coffee houses, art suppliers, and used furniture dealers. The slumming well-to-do and tourists flocked to Tower Town. Soapbox orators gathered in Bughouse Square, known now as Washington Square, to debate many of the same issues of our day: socialism, anarchy, anti-war activism, tax advocacy, religious zealotry, homosexuality, and free love among the frequent topics. Many artistic young women from small towns came to Chicago to study at the Art Institute and find work in the little theaters and in radio. Sheltered residential facilities sprang up to give them an alternative to Tower Town's often sinful ways. A struggling actress like Mary Ann Beam would be attracted by the cheap housing: walk-up apartment houses, subdivided old mansions, and one-time stables partitioned into studio flats. Nearby would have been cheap cafeterias and lunchrooms and night spots like the Chez Pierre, the Little Club, the Tent, and, of course, the Dill Pickle. Yes, and the terrible thin chicken sandwiches were real too. The Dill Pickle Club was a hole-in-the-wall joint tucked away in Tooker Alley. Its main door was painted orange and marked by a danger sign lit by a green light. At the entry were painted the words, "Step high, stoop low, and leave your dignity outside." Within was a main room with a stage, brightly painted tables and chairs with serving counters on either side. The club included a tea room where art exhibitions were mounted by Dill Pickle patrons. Friday and Saturday night dances featured jazz musicians on the theater stage. Among the artists and actors and hobos and prostitutes you might find Clarence Darrow, Emma Goldman, Upton Sinclair, Sherwood Anderson, or Carl Sandburg. The club's walls featured modern art with realism represented by nudes, reflecting life drawing classes whose models were an advertised draw. The Dill Pickle Players performed original works by local authors as well as by Ibsen, O'Neill, and Shaw, presumably fully clothed. The sex scenes in the Heller novels are fairly explicit, which, as I've mentioned, got me some criticism from a few of my peers back in 1983. To explain why I went where I did with Nate Heller, I'll have to explore how the private eye entered our pop culture. The three founding fathers of private eye fiction are Dashiell Hammett, Raymond Chandler, and Mickey Spillane. Basically, they represent the 30s, 40s, and 50s respectively. Everything that followed has been influenced by those writers. The writer who created the private eye in popular fiction, however, is not one of those three. It's the largely forgotten Carol John Daly, whose Race Williams was a sensation in his day as a star of Black Mask and other pulp magazines. Race Williams was a two-gun urban cowboy, so it helps to remember that Daly's first hard-boiled story appeared in 1922 and that the frontier era is said to have lasted till 1912. Only 10 years separates the private eye in fiction from the twilight of the dime novel gunslinger. Also in 1922, Dashiell Hammett began writing about a nameless private investigator he called only the Continental Op. The Op stories reflected Hammett's experiences as an investigator for the Pinkerton Detective Agency. None of the usual trappings of the private eye, the one-man office, the dutiful secretary, the cop friend, the cop enemy, the femme fatale, the parade of gangsters were yet in place. That wouldn't happen until Hammett wrote his famous novel, The Maltese Falcon, first published in 1929, which put all those tropes in position. Pretty much every fictional private eye since has evolved out of Hammett's Sam Spade. This includes Raymond Chandler's Philip Marlowe. Chandler was an admirer of Hammett's, feeling correctly that Hammett had transformed the mystery story into something uniquely American and approaching the literary. Chandler's first novel, introducing Marlowe as a combination of various detectives he'd created in Black Mask, debuted in 1939, The Big Sleep. Hammett was more realistic than Chandler, who, though born in America, had been classically schooled in Great Britain and had hopes for elevating the private eye novel into literature. He also created, in Philip Marlowe, an idealized hero. In a famous essay he wrote for The Atlantic in 1944, The Simple Art of Murder, he essentially listed the rules he expected a private eye hero to live by. These rules would have prevented the likes of Nate Heller from ever taking a bribe, expected him to be a great judge of character, wanted him to be proud, take any revenge dispassionately, and abhor shame and pettiness. And he certainly wouldn't despoil a virgin. As much as I respect and admire Raymond Chandler's work, I knew for Nate Heller to be real, I would have to break all of these rules. And I set out to do so, including having Nate bet a virgin named Mary Ann. Definitely, but also an amping up of the violence. Both the sex and violence of Spillane reflect his audience, including veterans like himself of World War II. The Depression-era kids who went to war and came home battle-scarred men were looking for stronger stuff in their entertainment. I have been an advocate of Spillane's, a defender of sorts, since I was a teenager. Chandler dismissed him as a comic book writer, which is how Mickey started out. But here's the reality. Only in the last 2 books Chandler wrote about Philip Marlowe, after Mike Hammer had become a sensation, did Marlowe ever sleep with a woman. He was celibate before that, at least on the page. Interestingly, Chandler and Ian Fleming were mutual admirers, though Fleming's James Bond was an attempt to create a British Mike Hammer. I would say he succeeded, and James Bond definitely had sexual conquests. It was necessary to do some compression, but most of the broad strokes are real, as are the people and places. Cermak dividing his time between the Biltmore and his son-in-law's place, going to the racetrack, having the 2 Harrys come along, it all happened. I wanted to spend some time on the shift between cold Chicago and warm Miami, showing Heller doing some real detective work and getting him and us used to the change of location. Cermak did add some private security to his team. The conversation between the Chicago mayor and Nate Heller is more frank, less guarded and layered than their initial confrontation. The idea behind Heller taking on the 2 Harrys was part of shifting the dynamic between Heller being rousted and him getting even. That's the revenge Chandler was talking about, but it's not dispassionate.